Archaeologists in Britain say they've made an astonishing find. They believe they've uncovered the remains of long-lost royalty. He happens to be King Richard III.
Now they're using 21st century techniques to see if it's really him.
Just recently, what is now described as the greatest medieval royal scandal of all time has just been unearthed, and it is tied to King Richard III. You're definitely not prepared for this truth. By extracting and analyzing DNA from ancient remains of King Richard III, scientists just uncovered a secret so terrifying, everyone has been dazed for days. Join us in this video as we uncover the terrifying details of this discovery. Paternity fraud, the terrifying revelation about King Richard III. For 10 years, the royal DNA scandal sat unresolved, history's hottest cold case. Then, in 2025, science finally caught up. An independent team at the University of Leicester, working alongside geneticists from Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, launched the Royal Bloodline Genomic Reanalysis Project. This time, they weren't limited to fragmented ancient DNA. They used cutting-edge long-read sequencing technology, methods capable of analyzing massive unbroken strands of DNA instead of scattered genetic debris. For the first time, the past could no longer hide in fragments. History was about to be tested, end to end. They needed more data points. Richard III's Y chromosome didn't match the modern Somerset family, but that alone wasn't enough. The problem was simple and maddening. No one knew which line represented the true Plantagenet bloodline. To solve it, the researchers needed an ancient control sample, someone who lived before any suspected break could have occurred. They found their answer at Westminster Abbey. With special permission, scientists sampled the tomb of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the son of Edward III. John of Gaunt died long before the possible rupture in the lineage. His DNA would serve as the key to decoding everything. What they found was explosive. First, deep genetic analysis showed with 99.9% certainty that the Somerset family's Y chromosome had remained intact all the way back to the 15th century. The break hadn't happened on their side. Then came the decisive test. John of Gaunt's Y chromosome was analyzed, and it matched the modern Somersets perfectly. That was the smoking gun. The Somerset line was the true original Plantagenet bloodline, which meant that Richard III's different Y chromosome could only mean one thing. The break happened in Richard's own immediate family. The 2025 study didn't merely suggest this, it proved it. The false paternity event occurred somewhere between Richard III's grandfather and Richard himself. Suddenly, the spotlight narrowed to one man, Richard, Duke of York, father of Richard III. And that's when a 500-year-old rumor snapped into a chilling focus. During the Wars of the Roses, enemies of the House of York spread a vicious accusation. They claimed Richard, Duke of York, was not the biological son of the man history credited as his father. They accused his mother, Cecily Neville, of having an affair while her husband was away at war. They even named the alleged father, a handsome English archer. At the time, the story was dismissed as political mudslinging, an ugly lie meant to undermine Yorkist legitimacy. But the 2025 DNA analysis changes everything. The science shows that the rumor was almost certainly true. Richard, Duke of York, the man who ignited the Wars of the Roses by claiming his bloodline was purer than the king's, was himself illegitimate. A dynasty built on a lie. Let that sink in. If the Duke of York had no legitimate claim, then neither did his children. That changes everything. His son, King Edward IV, the charismatic warrior who seized the throne by force, had no genetic right to rule. Edward's sons, the tragic princes in the Tower, were never legitimate heirs in the first place. And Richard III himself, the man who took the crown by declaring his nephews illegitimate, was also illegitimate. The irony is devastating. The entire House of York, the White Rose faction that fought a 30-year civil war for the throne of England, was built on a fundamental genetic lie. The Wars of the Roses tore the country apart. Tens of thousands were killed. Entire noble families were wiped from existence. At the Battle of Towton, more men died in a single day than in any other battle in English history. And according to the DNA, it was all for nothing. This brutal family feud between the Lancasters and the Yorks, this endless bloodshed over who had the rightful claim to rule, was settled by genetics half a millennium later. And the verdict is clear. The Yorks had no claim at all. This is the truth that was so carefully buried in the 2014 research. It wasn't just a random break in the bloodline, it was the break, the one that mattered most, the one that quietly invalidated an entire chapter of history. And instead of bringing closure, the 2025 discovery has opened the door to even darker questions. What questions? How many darker revelations lay unresolved? Keep watching to find out. The true villain might have been Cecily Neville. What if Cecily Neville knew? The official story claims her husband was away on campaign when she conveniently gave birth to a son. But what if that wasn't a coincidence? What if it was calculation? Some historians are now seriously revisiting the so-called peasant bassinet theory. What if Cecily simply acquired a healthy infant from a servant, or even a peasant, and passed the child off as her own? In this version of events, Cecily Neville isn't a passive victim of circumstance. She's a political mastermind, someone who, with one desperate and audacious lie, may have set the entire Wars of the Roses in motion. A single deception. An entire nation at war. What if King Edward IV knew? Richard III later claimed that Edward had signed a pre-contract of marriage to Lady Eleanor Butler before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, an arrangement that would have rendered Edward's children illegitimate. For centuries, historians dismissed this as propaganda, a legal fiction Richard invented to justify his seizure of the throne. But what if it wasn't a lie? What if Edward knew his bloodline was already compromised and spent his reign trying to outrun that truth? Seen through that lens, Edward's behavior looks different. The relentless marriages into powerful families, the obsession with appearances, the public excess, the charm, the spectacle. Not recklessness, but distraction. A king masking a fatal weakness by surrounding himself with legitimacy he didn't possess. And what if Richard was the only one who didn't know? Imagine him as the loyal younger brother, devoted to Edward, believing completely in the righteousness of the House of York. Then, and imagine the moment everything cracks. A deathbed confession, a buried document, a whispered truth passed too late to ignore. Suddenly, his entire worldview collapses. In that light, Richard III becomes something far more complex than a simple tyrant. He becomes a man confronting the revelation that his family's claim to power was a fraud, and that reframes the darkest act of his reign. What if the removal of the princes in the tower wasn't merely a cold calculation for power? What if it was a desperate, twisted attempt to erase the evidence of a lie he had only just discovered? Perhaps Richard didn't see his nephews as rivals, but as living proof of a bloodline that should never have ruled. In his mind, maybe they had to disappear, not just to take the crown, but to fix what could never be fixed. This is the truth they tried to bury. And this is why the 2014 discovery was handled so delicately. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was explosive. How did it all begin? Keep watching to find out. The discovery that opened up the scandal. Back in 2012, the world was stunned when researchers discovered a skeleton buried beneath a Leicester parking lot. 2 years later, in 2014, DNA testing confirmed what had once seemed impossible. The remains belonged to King Richard III, a monarch who had been missing for more than 500 years. The announcement sparked global celebration and fascination. But what most people never heard was this. That very same DNA analysis revealed something far more troubling, something politically explosive. It was so sensitive that scientists quietly tucked it away in the footnotes of their research paper. For nearly a decade, that secret sat there, unnoticed, hiding in plain sight. Now, in 2025, new findings have finally brought that buried truth to the surface. And it isn't just surprising. It forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the Wars of the Roses, the legitimacy of medieval kings, and one of the bloodiest power struggles in English history. A king buried under a parking lot sounds almost absurd, like the punchline to a bad joke. But for 527 years, that is exactly where King Richard III lay, forgotten. Richard was the last English king to die on the battlefield. He was killed at Bosworth Field in 1485. His enemies, the victorious Tudors, were determined to humiliate him even in death. His naked body was paraded through the streets of Leicester, slung over a horse like a sack of grain. The message was unmistakable. This dynasty is over. He was buried quickly, without ceremony, in an unmarked grave at Greyfriars Church. Years later, during the Reformation, the church was torn down. The land was sold, built over, and eventually erased from memory. Rumors began to spread. Some claimed his bones had been dug up and thrown into the River Soar. For centuries, no one knew the truth, until a car park gave it up. Most historians believed Richard was lost forever, gone to time, rumor, and legend. That changed when a screenwriter named Philippa Langley became obsessed with finding him. She spent years poring over medieval maps, carefully layering the streets of Old Leicester over the modern city. Again and again, her research pointed to one deeply unremarkable place, a city council parking lot. Everyone told her she was chasing a fantasy. The experts insisted Richard's bones had been thrown into the river, but Langley wouldn't let it go. Against the odds, she convinced the University of Leicester to take a chance. When the excavation began in August 2012, the results were immediate. On the very first day, archaeologists uncovered human leg bones. What emerged from the ground was astonishing. Skeleton 1, as they initially called it, belonged to a man in his early 30s. He had been buried in a grave too small for his body, forcing his head into an unnatural, cramped position. This was not the careful burial of a respected king. It was rushed, disrespectful, the work of enemies. The skeleton showed 10 wounds, 8 of them to the skull. This wasn't death by chance or stray arrow. It was intimate, violent, and deliberate. 2 injuries were fatal: a sword blow to the base of the skull and a halberd thrust driven straight through the top of the head. This was a man dragged from his horse, surrounded, and finished off in a frenzy. But one detail sent a shock through the team: the spine. The skeleton had severe scoliosis, a pronounced sideways curve that would have caused one shoulder to sit noticeably higher than the other. For centuries, Tudor propaganda had portrayed Richard as a grotesque, twisted hunchback. The bones told a subtler truth. The condition was real, but exaggerated, weaponized for political smearing. Then came the chemical clues. Isotope analysis of the teeth revealed a diet rich in seafood and wine, the expensive fare of the elite. A man of high status. Piece by piece, the evidence aligned. Everything pointed to one conclusion: they had found him. Still, suspicion demanded certainty. History demanded proof. They needed DNA. And that's where certainty met something far more unsettling: the perfect match and an impossible break. Extracting usable DNA from bones that are more than 500 years old is extraordinarily difficult. Over time, DNA breaks down, splintering into tiny fragments. Even worse, it's incredibly easy to contaminate. A single skin cell, a stray hair, one careless touch can ruin everything. That's why Dr. Turi King and her team worked under strict, sterile conditions. They carefully drilled into the king's tooth and femur, extracting what little genetic material remained. Their mission was simple in theory, but daunting in practice. Find a living relative and see if the DNA matched. Did they find a living relative? How much proof could they extract from the tiny DNA they could find? Let's see. A century-year-old scandal. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Most DNA gets reshuffled with every generation, which makes it nearly useless for tracing specific family lines across centuries. But there are 2 crucial exceptions. The first is mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. It passes unchanged from a mother to all her children, forming an unbroken genetic thread through the maternal line. Richard III left no surviving children, but he did have an older sister, Anne of York. Genealogists followed Anne's female line across 17 generations, leading to 2 living descendants: Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker living in London, and Wendy Duldig. When scientists compared the skeleton's mitochondrial DNA to Michael Ibsen's, the result was astonishing: a perfect match. Even more compelling, They shared a rare haplogroup found in only a tiny fraction of Europeans. The odds of that happening by chance were vanishingly small. In February 2013, the University of Leicester made the announcement. Beyond reasonable doubt, the remains were those of King Richard III. The world celebrated, but the scientists weren't finished. There was one more test to run. The Y chromosome is passed exclusively from father to son, creating a genetic signature along the paternal line. If history was accurate, Richard's Y chromosome should match that of modern male line descendants of Edward III, Richard's great-great-grandfather. The team tracked them down. The samples were tested. The results came back as a complete mismatch. Not close, not partial, total failure to align. Somewhere across the 19 generations separating Richard III from his living male line relatives, a father was not who the records claimed he was. In plain terms, the DNA revealed a hidden royal scandal, a break in the bloodline that history had never recorded. Where did this scandal happen? Could it be traced with precision? Keep watching to find out. The royal illegitimate cover-up. The Y chromosome results sent shockwaves through the historical community. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't trivia. This was seismic. For centuries, the Plantagenet claim to the English throne rested on one sacred idea: an unbroken father-to-son bloodline believed to be divinely ordained. Kings ruled because their blood said they should. But the DNA told a different story. The bloodline wasn't pure. So where did it break? That was the million-dollar question. In 2014, a research paper published in Nature Communications laid out two possible explanations, both given equal weight. The first possibility was the safer one. The break happened after Richard III, somewhere in the last 500 years, among the Somerset descendants. If true, it would amount to an awkward but limited scandal, a problem for one noble family. History itself would remain intact. The second possibility was far more explosive. What if the break happened before Richard III? That would mean Richard himself, or his father, or his brother, King Edward IV, had no legitimate blood claim to the throne at all. It would mean the Wars of the Roses, a brutal 30-year conflict that reshaped England, was fought over a genetic lie. Tens of thousands dead, dynasties destroyed, all based on an inheritance that never existed. The 2014 research team admitted they couldn't determine where the break occurred. At the time, the science simply wasn't advanced enough, so they presented both possibilities as equally likely. In doing so, they softened the blow. That uncertainty allowed the world to focus on the triumph. The king had been found. The Y chromosome mismatch was treated as a strange, unsolvable footnote, interesting but safely contained. But the truth was far more disturbing than anyone publicly admitted, and the technology needed to uncover it was only a decade away. What was the War of the Roses? How did one lie spark something so bloody? Keep watching to find out. Revisiting the bloodiest civil war. The Wars of the Roses, known to people at the time as the Civil Wars and later as the Cousins' War, were a long and violent struggle for control of the English throne. They lasted from 1455 to 1487 and were marked by repeated outbreaks of open warfare. The conflict was fought between two rival branches of England's royal family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, represented by a white rose. Both descended from the royal house of Plantagenet, and both believed they had the stronger claim to rule. By 1471, the fighting had wiped out the male line of the Lancastrian family. That collapse left the Tudor family, linked to Lancaster through the female line, to inherit the claim to the throne. The wars finally came to an end when the two rival houses were united through marriage, creating the Tudor dynasty, which would go on to rule England. The roots of the conflict ran deep. England was already strained by the long and costly 100 Years' War with France, which had drained resources and weakened royal authority. At the same time, powerful nobles controlled private armies through a system known as bastard feudalism, giving them enormous military influence outside the crown's control. These tensions were made worse by the mental instability of Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, whose inability to rule effectively reopened old questions about who truly deserved the throne. Henry's weakness revived the ambitions of his cousin, Richard, Duke of York, who believed his bloodline gave him a stronger claim. Open war broke out in 1455 when Yorkist forces captured the king at the First Battle of St. Albans. Parliament responded by appointing York as Lord Protector, effectively placing him in charge of the kingdom. Fighting resumed 4 years later. Yorkist forces, led by Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, captured Henry again at the Battle of Northampton. When York later attempted to press his claim to the throne outright, he was killed at the Battle of Wakefield. His claim then passed to his son, Edward, under the controversial Act of Accord. The conflict reached a turning point in 1461. After briefly losing control of Henry at the Second Battle of St. Albans, the Yorkists regrouped and crushed the Lancastrian army at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Later that year, Edward was formally crowned king, marking the rise of the Yorkist dynasty and setting the stage for decades of instability, betrayal, and bloodshed that would reshape England forever. However, something else was brewing, something that would cause a major shift. What was that? What shifts did it cause? Keep watching to find out. The end of medieval England. In 1464, Edward IV shocked his closest allies by marrying Elizabeth Woodville in secret. The match went directly against the advice of his most powerful supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and overturned Warwick's careful strategy of strengthening ties with France. The fallout was swift. In 1469, Warwick rebelled against Edward. His forces defeated a Yorkist army at the Battle of Edgecote, and Edward was briefly imprisoned. Warwick hoped to replace the king with Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, but the plan collapsed. Edward was soon released and restored to power. Warwick wasn't finished. Within a year, he returned, this time invading England alongside Margaret of Anjou, the formidable wife of Henry VI. Edward was forced to flee to Flanders, and in 1470, Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne. The restoration didn't last. With military support from Burgundy, Edward launched a counter-invasion in 1471. He defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, crushing the rebellion. Soon after, Edward defeated the Lancastrians again at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Henry VI's only son was killed. Henry himself was returned to the Tower of London, where he soon died, almost certainly on Edward's orders. With his rivals eliminated, Edward IV ruled unchallenged for the next 12 years. In these 12 years, England entered a rare period of relative peace. That calm ended abruptly in April 1483, when Edward died unexpectedly. He was succeeded by his 12-year-old son, Edward V, whose reign lasted just 78 days before he was deposed by his uncle, Richard III. Richard's accession was immediately controversial, especially after Edward IV's two sons vanished from public view. His rule sparked rebellion and widespread defections among former Yorkist supporters. Amid the chaos, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, descended from Edward III through Lady Margaret Beaufort, returned from exile with an army. In 1485, he defeated and killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry took the throne as Henry VII and moved quickly to secure his rule. He married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, symbolically uniting the rival houses of Lancaster and York. The Wars of the Roses finally ended in 1487, when Henry defeated the last Yorkist resistance at the Battle of Stoke Field. The House of Tudor would rule England until 1603, a period that strengthened royal authority, stabilized the crown, and marked the end of medieval England. Was there any justifiable reason for the war other than selfish ambitions? Keep watching to find out. Justifying the War of the Roses. The Lancastrian claim to the English throne rested on a crucial principle: descent through the male line. Edward III had explicitly favored male line inheritance, and this emphasis gave Lancaster a strong legal foundation. It was on this basis that Henry IV justified his decision to depose Richard II and take the crown for himself. That claim, however, was not uncontested. From a strictly genealogical standpoint, the rightful heir could be argued to be Edmund Mortimer, the great-grandson of Edward III's second surviving son, Mortimer's problem was not the proximity of blood, but how that bloodline passed down to him. His claim came through the female line, inherited from his grandmother, a fact that weakened his position under the male preference rules of the time. Within the House of Lancaster itself, another important branch emerged, the House of Beaufort. The Beauforts were descended from John of Gaunt and his longtime mistress, Catherine Swynford. Their children were born illegitimate, but later legitimized when Gaunt married Catherine, with Parliament formally recognizing their status. Even so, their path to power was firmly blocked. When Henry IV became king, he took deliberate steps to exclude the Beaufort family from the line of succession. Legitimized or not, they were barred from inheriting the throne, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for English history in the generations to come. Some historians have questioned how deeply the Wars of the Roses actually reshaped English society and culture. Revisionist scholars, including the Oxford historian K.B. Macfarlane, argue that the long-term impact of the conflict has often been overstated. According to this view, large parts of England were barely touched by the fighting. Regions such as East Anglia, for example, experienced little direct disruption. Even in the more densely populated areas, both sides had strong incentives to limit destruction. Prolonged sieges and widespread pillaging would have devastated the very lands and resources they depended on. So commanders often pushed for quick, decisive battles instead. As a result, extended sieges were relatively rare, and when they did occur, such as at Harlech or Bamburgh, they tended to take place in remote, sparsely populated regions, far from England's economic and population centers. Were there harrowing effects of such extended periods of fighting? What were they? Keep watching to find out. The dark sides of the war no one ever talks about. Observers at the time noticed this difference. In 1470, Philippe de Commines remarked that England was unusual compared to conflicts on the European continent. While continental wars often brought widespread suffering to civilians, in England, the damage was largely confined to soldiers and the nobility. Ordinary citizens and private property were, more often than not, spared the worst effects of war. In short, while the Wars of the Roses were violent and politically transformative, some historians argue they were far less socially destructive than legend suggests. The instability created by the Wars of the Roses gave ambitious nobles room to advance their own interests, often at the expense of rivals and even the crown itself. By the 15th century, England was already drifting away from traditional medieval feudalism toward a system historians call bastard feudalism. Under this system, wealthy landowners no longer relied on feudal obligations alone. Instead, they used money, patronage, and favors to build private armies of retainers who were loyal to them personally. This allowed powerful nobles to amass wealth, dominate local politics, and weaken royal authority at the regional level. As central control eroded, many towns made little effort to maintain their defenses. City walls were often left in disrepair or only partially rebuilt. London is a striking example. Unable to restore its fortifications, the city avoided destruction largely by persuading both Yorkist and Lancastrian forces to stay out. Ironically, London's lack of defenses made it strategically pointless to attack. It is true that most fighting took place between nobles and their private armies, and that the wars were intermittent, spread across decades, with fewer than 24 months of actual combat in total. Even so, ordinary people were not entirely untouched. When nobles raised militias from their estate workers, local populations were sometimes drawn directly into the conflict. Despite the violence, relatively few noble families were completely wiped out. In fact, between 1425 and 1449, before the wars began, roughly the same number of noble lines died out from natural causes as did between 1450 and 1474, the most intense period of fighting. That said, several powerful families, such as the Nevilles, saw their influence permanently broken. The direct male line of the Plantagenet dynasty was also extinguished. Even so, every later English monarch, except during the brief interruption of the Commonwealth of England and the Protectorate, descended from Edward III, though through the female line rather than the male. While civilians were not routinely targeted, the human cost was still significant. An estimated 105,000 people died during the wars, about 5.5% of England's population in 1450. Remarkably, by 1490, the population had grown by more than 12% compared to 1450, showing that England not only survived the conflict, but recovered with surprising speed. In the end, the Wars of the Roses reshaped power at the top, but left the broader fabric of English society more resilient than legend often suggests. Wars are direct offshoots of lies and greed and power. What do you think about the truths that have now been uncovered about King Richard III? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for staying till the end. We hope that from now on, you pay closer attention to powerful family feuds and the narratives no one ever talks about. You never know. The truth might just be hidden in plain sight. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Click the next video shown on your screen to catch up on more interesting stories like this. See you there.